It's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Scott Neubauer. Dr. Scott Neubauer is an ecosystem ecologist and biogeochemist with broad interests in understanding the functioning of ecosystems, especially coastal wetlands, and their responses to environmental change at both global and local scales. Current projects include studies on the effects of saltwater intrusion into tidal freshwater wetlands, the responses of wetland accretion to changing watershed sediment. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at Virginia Commonwealth University, a position he began in 2012 after having spent 8 years as an assistant research professor and the assistant director of the University of South Carolina's Baruch Marine Field Laboratory. He earned his PhD from the College of William and Mary, Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And with that, I'd like to pass the presentation over to our speaker, Dr. Scott Neubauer.
Okay, thank you very much, Julian, for that introduction, and also thank you for the invitation to speak as part of this SWS webinar series. I really enjoyed our first webinar last month, and I hope that this will continue, what hopefully will become a trend of excellent talks. I'd like to thank those of you in the audience for tuning in to listen to me talk today. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author. He's going to be a silent co-author on this talk, but Pat McGonigal has helped with the development of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today, also with the development of this presentation itself. Both Pat and I we're wetland biogeochemists, and we spend a lot of our time studying how elements flow through wetlands, looking at carbon and nitrogen and sulfur cycles and things like that. And a lot of our work touches on the factors that control the production and consumption of various greenhouse gases. But what I want to do today is not focus on the detailed biogeochemistry work that we typically do, but take a step back and ask the question of how we can determine the role that wetlands play in influencing global climate. In order to do that, I want to first start by introducing some background concepts about ways in which wetlands could potentially influence climate. And then the next three bullet points, bullet points here are different ways that we could assess whether wetlands are having a net warming or cooling effect on the climate. And then I want to wrap up with a few concluding thoughts and directions for moving forward to help us get a better handle on the role of wetlands in climate. Now, if we look on a global basis, wetlands store an awful lot of carbon. They store about 16% of all carbon that's stored in the terrestrial landscape, even though wetlands account for only about 3% of the total land area. So relative to their area, wetlands are disproportionately effective at storing soil carbon. And this is important in the context of climate because carbon that's stored in soil or in woody wetlands in wood represents carbon dioxide that's no longer in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide that's not in the atmosphere can't act as a greenhouse gas. So removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in soils is a good way for wetlands to have a cooling effect on the climate. Now, these wetland soil stocks, they've developed in some cases over tens of thousands of years. So those large soil stocks represent the history of wetlands, but we also find that wetlands are very effective. They have high rates of carbon sequestration, and that's what we can see in this graph on the left, where rates of carbon sequestration in a variety of forests, the three leftmost bars on the screen there, are much lower than rates of carbon storage in a variety of coastal wetlands, salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And this is a general trend when we compare wetlands with upland habitats. Rates of carbon sequestration tend to be higher in wetlands than they do in drier upland habitats. But there's a bad side to wetlands when we're talking about climate, and that is that wetlands can emit other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, most notably methane. If we look at the total methane emissions from natural wetlands and also rice paddies, we see that wetlands account for about 40% of the total global methane emissions to the atmosphere over a typical year. This is from both natural and anthropogenic sources. So wetlands are taking up a greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, but they're also emitting a powerful greenhouse gas as methane to the atmosphere. And rates of methane emissions from wetlands vary as a function of latitude, they vary as a function of vegetation type, they vary as a function of salinity, but on the whole, wetlands are strong sources of methane to the atmosphere. Now, relative to what we know about carbon storage and methane fluxes, we know almost nothing about nitrous oxide fluxes, which is another important greenhouse gas. Some studies have shown that wetlands are sinks for nitrous oxide, other wetlands appear to be sources for nitrous oxide, And recent work has demonstrated that increasing nutrient, specifically nitrogen availability to wetlands, will often lead to an increase in nitrous oxide fluxes from those wetlands to the atmosphere. But an EPA report that came out 5 years ago concluded that based on the available evidence, wetlands are, at present, a negligible source or sink for methane. So they're really not playing a big role in global nitrous oxide budgets. So for that reason, I'm not going to talk about nitrous oxide too much in the rest of this talk, although the concepts that I'm talking about with methane and carbon dioxide will generally apply to nitrous oxide as well. Another concept we need to think about is the idea of radiative balance. So in the lower left of your screen, we have a carbon budget that I pulled together for Sweet Hall Marsh, which is a low salinity tidal wetland located on the Pamunkey River in Virginia, where I've done a fair amount of work. And I'm not going to talk about all the details of the carbon cycle at this site, but I will point out that the site emits methane to the atmosphere every year, and it also is storing carbon in the soil. So the radiative balance will give us the static effects, kind of a snapshot view of how this system is affecting the balance between incoming and outgoing energy within Earth's climate system. So if the methane emissions, the warming due to those methane emissions are more than offsetting the cooling due to carbon sequestration in the soil, this system would lead to more trapping of energy within the climate system, causing warming. So that's the radiative balance, kind of a snapshot view. There's another similar term called the radiative forcing, which isn't a snapshot view, but it's a measure of how a perturbation has changed the balance between incoming and outgoing energy. And in the context of climate talks, this is typically expressed relative to 1750, so before the Industrial Revolution. In this figure from the last IPCC report, if we'll just look at the top bar here, we can see that radiative forcing from carbon dioxide is the largest single factor that's been affecting climate since 1750. And this isn't, or so the reason for this is because carbon dioxide concentrations have increased over time. If carbon dioxide concentrations hadn't changed, it would still be contributing to the radiative balance, but it wouldn't be causing radiative forcing. So we can illustrate this with a wetland example. We have a hypothetical wetland that is emitting methane to the atmosphere. It's also taking up carbon dioxide and storing it in the soils. Now, at any given point in time, the radiative balance of this wetland might be positive, meaning it's having a warming effect, or it might be negative, having a cooling effect. That's not the same as radiative forcing. If this wetland, in terms of its methane and carbon dioxide fluxes, hasn't changed since pre-1750 to today, no matter what its radiative balance is, we would say its radiative forcing is 0. If there's been no change in the radiative balance, there is no radiative forcing. But we can see changes in radiative forcing if something has affected the wetland that has caused either its methane emissions or its carbon dioxide uptake to change. So one example would be if the hydrology changed and the site was flooded more often. That might increase methane emissions, which would cause a greater warming effect. So in this case, we would say there was positive radiative forcing from this wetland. So the radiative balance and radiative forcing are related concepts, but they're not exactly the same. The balance is a snapshot, whereas the radiative forcing it quantifies the effect of a perturbation to the system. Okay, so the question then is, how do we determine the radiative balance or the radiative forcing? And what has been done for more than 20 years is that we have used global warming potentials to make this comparison of the warming due to methane emissions and the cooling due to carbon sequestration. And here we have a chart or a table showing global warming potentials for a variety of gases. The global warming potential, by definition, is the time-integrated radiative forcing due to a pulse emission of a given component. This would be something like a greenhouse gas as methane or nitrous oxide. And we're comparing that integrated radiative forcing to the forcing due to a pulse emission of an equal mass of carbon dioxide. And we can see in the table that global warming potentials vary as a function of gas. So some gases are in the atmosphere longer or are more effective at trapping heat, whereas others are different. And we also see that global warming potentials vary as a function of the time frame that we're interested in. So you may have heard or read statements to the effect that methane is 28 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. That comes from the global warming potential. Now, the history of the global warming potential goes back to the 1990 IPCC report. This was the first synthesis report that the IPCC put out. And in that report, they introduced the global warming potential. And I just want to read a quote from that report. "It must be stressed that there is no universally accepted methodology for combining all the relevant factors into a single metric. A simple approach, i.e. the global warming potential, has been adopted here to illustrate the difficulties inherent in the concept." So even when the global warming potential was first introduced, the IPCC recognized that this is not a perfect metric, and they're actually using it to illustrate the challenges associated with comparing the warming due to different greenhouse gases, not saying that the global warming potential is how we should be doing this. But from its introduction in 1990, the global warming potential has been adopted in a lot of policy contexts. And I think one of the reasons why it's been adopted is because it's very simple to use, and I'll illustrate that on the next slide, but the global warming potential also does a really good job of capturing a key driver of climate, namely radiative forcing, and it does so with minimal uncertainty. So from its introduction in the 1990 IPCC synthesis report, the global warming potential has been used in the Kyoto Protocol, which took that protocol from a single gas protocol focused on carbon dioxide to a multi-gas protocol that considers multiple greenhouse gases. The global warming potential is in the Verified Carbon Standard, which has been used in getting ecosystems into carbon markets, so it's part of various wetland methodologies. It's part of RED, which is the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation program. And then the global warming potential in policy circles has made an appearance in various regulatory markets, such as California's Cap and Trade program. Scientists have also used the global warming potentials in a variety of contexts, and we've been doing so for more than 20 years. So I want to illustrate how that's done in the scientific context. So here we have our carbon budget from Sweethall Marsh again. And what we want to do is compare the warming due to methane emissions with the cooling due to carbon sequestration. And really the math is quite simple. We just have to take our methane emission, convert it to grams of methane instead of grams of carbon, because those are the units that the global warming potential is based on, and then multiply it by our 100-year global warming potential to effectively convert that methane flux into units of carbon dioxide equivalents. So we can see that this methane flux from Sweethall Marsh is contributing the equivalent of almost 2,700 grams of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere per meter squared of marsh per year. For carbon, we just need to convert the carbon sequestration rate to units of carbon dioxide, and we find that this marsh is sequestering the equivalent of 840 grams of carbon dioxide per meter squared per year. Comparing the two numbers, we see that the warming due to methane in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents exceeds the cooling due to carbon sequestration. So we say that this site over a 100-year period has a positive radiative balance. In other words, it's contributing to warming. So the global warming potential has been used to ask questions like this by the scientific community for over 20 years, in part as with the adoption of the global warming potential in policy context, because it's really easy. You just have to multiply a number by 28, and anybody can do that. But I think there's also been, and I've been guilty of this myself, there's been an uncritical acceptance of what was presented as a policy tool, and then we're using that policy tool to answer scientific questions. And what I want to spend the rest of today's webinar talking about is the idea that maybe policy tools aren't necessarily appropriate for asking science questions. So in a paper that came out in Ecosystems last month, Pat and we made the argument that we shouldn't be using, we as wetland and ecosystem scientists should not be using the global warming potentials if we're interested in understanding how ecosystems are affecting climate. And the statement at the bottom here is a quote from our conclusions. Our analyses indicate that the use of global warming potentials for assessing the climatic impacts of ecosystems is fundamentally untenable. So we have made the argument in this paper, and I'm going to make the argument today in this webinar, that we should not be using global warming potentials if we're interested in understanding how wetlands are affecting climate. And the reason for this argument goes back to the definition of the global warming potential. The global warming potential deals with pulse emissions of gas. So a one-time emission of methane or a one-time emission of nitrous oxide. And then there's that single pulse, and we look at how that pulse affects atmospheric energy budgets over a 20-year period or a 100-year period or a 500-year period. But we know from many, many studies done in wetlands and other ecosystems that the exchanges of materials between ecosystems and the atmosphere don't just happen once. They happen year after year after year after year. So the question then is a metric that is designed and by definition deals with a pulse emission is that appropriate for an ecosystem where the fluxes occur persistently and continuously? And our argument is that the answer to that question is no. So what I want to do now is introduce two new metrics that do allow or do take into account the fact that wetlands and other ecosystems exchange greenhouse gases with the atmosphere persistently. The sustained flux global warming potential and the sustained flux global cooling potential. Now we developed these, or we calculated values for these metrics by using a well-established and reasonably simple atmospheric perturbation model. So we're looking at how our wetland is changing the amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere of our model system. For both nitrous oxide and methane, the model is fairly simple, where the amount of these gases in the atmosphere is simply a function of how quickly those gases are being added to the atmosphere or potentially removed from the atmosphere, and the rate at which those gases are broken down chemically once they're in the atmosphere. The modeling of carbon dioxide gets a little more complex. So the amount of carbon dioxide that's removed from our wetland is going to depend on the rate at which carbon is being sequestered in the soils or in woody biomass, but it also depends on the rate at which methane is being emitted from the marsh, because one of the assumptions of our model is that the pool of labile organic carbon and soil carbon dioxide is at steady state. So in order to support methane being emitted from the marsh, there must be an uptake of carbon dioxide that can then be converted to methane. So we have to consider the rate of methane emissions. Now, as methane in the atmosphere is oxidized, that produces carbon dioxide, so we also have to take into account methane oxidation. And then unlike methane and nitrous oxide, which are chemically destroyed in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide isn't broken down in the atmosphere, but instead we can think of it as re-equilibrating with a variety of biological and geological and chemical reservoirs around the planet. And this happens over a variety of time scales. So over relatively short periods, a perturbation to the carbon dioxide pool in the atmosphere will come to a new equilibrium with the biosphere and the surface ocean. Over longer time periods, it'll reach equilibrium with the deep ocean. And then over geological timescales, it'll reach equilibrium with the rock weathering cycle. So carbon dioxide undergoes these equilibration processes once we either add or remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we wanted to apply this model in a few different ways. The first thing we did was to see if we could reproduce the global warming potentials. So the global warming potential, remember, is comparing the radiative forcing due to a pulse emission of a greenhouse gas with a pulse emission of carbon dioxide. So we, in our model, added in separate model runs, we added a kilogram of methane or a kilogram of nitrous oxide to our model atmosphere, or removed a kilogram of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I'll just note that in the model, the behavior of the carbon dioxide pool is symmetrical, depending whether it's added or removed. It's just the sign of the flux changes. So we did this model run where we added a pulse of these gases to the atmosphere, and then we looked at how the radiative forcing due to those gases changed as those gases reached new equilibrium or equilibria, or as they were destroyed in the atmosphere. We did not have annual new inputs of these gases into the atmosphere, so we're trying to reproduce the global warming potential. And when we do that, it looks something like this, where we have on the top of the figure a pulse of methane added to the atmosphere, and as that methane gets oxidized, the radiative forcing due to that pulse gets smaller and smaller until it's close to zero by the end of a 100-year time period. When we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it causes an immediate cooling effect, and then as that carbon dioxide perturbation reaches a new equilibrium with the biological and geological reservoirs around the planet, that cooling effect gets smaller. It never gets quite as small as the methane effect, or excuse me, as the methane pulse does though. We can look at the cumulative radiative forcing, which is basically the area under this curve from any given time point back to zero, and we can see that, as we would expect, cumulative radiative forcing changes over time. And I'm not going to focus on the shape of these curves, but I'll just note that we can calculate the cumulative radiative forcing after a 100-year time period, and that lets us calculate global warming potentials as the ratio of the cumulative radiative forcing of methane relative to the cumulative radiative forcing of carbon dioxide. And when we do that, we find that the global warming potential from this perturbation model is 32. How does that compare with what's been reported by the IPCC? Well, we can see that on this figure here, where the dashed lines on both the methane panel and the nitrous oxide panel represent the global warming potential calculated by our perturbation model over a variety of timescales. And the solid symbols on each panel represent the global warming potentials at 20 and 100 years as reported in the latest IPC synthesis report. And what we can see is that this simple model is doing a really good job of reproducing the global warming potentials that are reported by the IPCC. So we're capturing what happens when we have a pulse of gas. The next question is, what happens when our gas emissions are continuous, as would happen with a wetland or other natural ecosystem? So in this set of model runs, we separately added 1 kilogram of methane to our atmosphere every year, or 1 kilogram of nitrous oxide, or we removed 1 kilogram of CO2 from the atmosphere. And we looked at what happened in terms of radiative forcing when we did these things. So conceptually, it looks like this, where we're treating these annual emissions as a series of pulses, one per year. So you can see, for the first 10 years, I drew out every single pulse, and then I spaced them out a little bit farther so the graph would be a little simpler. But we have this series of pulses that are happening over our 100-year time period. If we add up the radiative forcing from each of those individual pulses, we end up with the instantaneous radiative forcing, which we can see for methane reaches a plateau after about 50 years. And that's because the rate at which methane is being broken down in the atmosphere is a function of how much methane is in the atmosphere. So after about 4 lifetimes, which is roughly 50 years, the amount of methane being added to the atmosphere is the same as the amount of methane being oxidized every year. For carbon dioxide, we can see it never does reach that equilibrium, and that's driven by the fact that carbon dioxide is equilibrating with these various reservoirs over a variety of timescales, one of which happens over geological time, which is much longer than the time frame of our model run here. If we look at cumulative radiative forcing, we can determine the ratio of the radiative forcing due to continuous methane emissions and the radiative forcing due to continuous CO2 uptake. And we can look at the ratio of these to get what our metric would be if we have sustained emissions of greenhouse gases and not a single pulse. So just as a reminder, the global warming potential is due to a pulse emission of a component. The sustained flux global warming potential is the time-integrated radiative forcing due to sustained emissions of a given component. So emissions year after year after year relative to sustained sequestration of an equal mass of carbon dioxide. If we graphically or tabularly compare the values of global warming potentials with sustained flux global warming potentials, we see that the values, well, they're different. They're not the same. And if we look at the 100-year time point, which is most commonly used when people are applying global warming potentials in either policy or scientific contexts, we can see for methane that the sustained flux global warming potential is 40% larger than the pulse global warming potential. For nitrous oxide, the difference is only a few percent, but if we go to longer timescales for nitrous oxide, the difference becomes quite significant. So in a few slides, I'm going to talk about the implications of these differences between the pulse and the sustained flux global warming potentials if we're interested in understanding the climatic role of ecosystems. But first, I want to talk about how we use the sustained flux global warming potential. And the answer is we use it exactly as we do the global warming potential. We convert our methane flux to units of grams of methane, multiply it by our sustained flux global warming potential, and we figure out that from Sweet Hall Marsh, the methane emissions there are equivalent to emitting over 4,000 grams of carbon dioxide per meter squared per year. Remember, with the global warming potential, that number was around 2,700 grams of carbon dioxide equivalents per meter squared per year. So the sustained flux global warming potential tells us that this methane flux is having a much bigger effect on the climate than we would conclude if we used the global warming potential. Okay, the carbon sequestration flux doesn't change, nor does our conclusion that the site has a positive radiative balance and is contributing to warming, but using the sustained flux global warming potential suggests that that warming effect is much greater than we would conclude if we had used the global warming potential. In the course of running our model, we also were interested in what happens not if there are emissions of methane or nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, but what if we have an ecosystem that is taking up these gases? So in separate model runs, we removed 1 kilogram of methane or nitrous oxide or CO2 from the atmosphere and looked to see how radiative forcing changed when we had continuous removal of gases instead of continuous addition of gases. So that leads us to a new metric, the sustained flux global cooling potential. We did find that the sustained flux global warming and global cooling potential values were quite different, which I'll show you on the next slide. But we have the sustained flux global cooling potential that lets us ask questions about what happens if an ecosystem is taking up greenhouse gases year after year instead of emitting them to the atmosphere. So I've added one more column to this table, the sustained flux global cooling potential. And there are a few points I want to make about this table. The first is that using global warming potentials for pulse emissions instead of sustained flux global warming potentials would cause us to underestimate warming due to either methane or nitrous oxide emissions. Now, we saw in the case of Sweet Hall Marsh, we still reached the same conclusion that that site had a positive radiative balance and was contributing to warming, but the magnitude of that radiative balance differs depending on whether we use the sustained or the pulse global warming potential metrics. It's possible that in some ecosystems, the ratio of carbon dioxide sequestered to methane emitted could lie between the global warming and the sustained flux global warming potentials. If that were to happen, one metric would be telling us that the radiative balance for that site was negative and that ecosystem was having a net cooling effect on the climate. The other metric would tell us the opposite, that that site was having a warming effect on the climate. So as I mentioned before, and as I'll mention again later, all metrics have assumptions and limitations to them. So the question is, which metric should we use? And I want to make the argument that in the context of understanding the role of ecosystems in influencing global climate, we should use a metric that more accurately captures the continuous emissions of greenhouse gases and the exchanges of greenhouse gases between wetlands and atmospheres, and not a metric that relies on a single pulse emission, which is an unrealistic assumption for any natural ecosystem. The other point I want to make about this table is that there's a big difference between the sustained flux global warming and global cooling potentials, and that the difference between these metrics gets bigger as we go to longer timescales. So that suggests strongly to us that if you have an ecosystem that is taking up methane or taking up nitrous oxide, but you use the global warming potential or the sustained global warming potential, you would significantly underestimate the cooling effect due to that uptake of methane or nitrous oxide. So you have to take into account whether the direction of the flux when you're trying to figure out how that ecosystem is affecting climate. So in this next slide, I want to apply this knowledge to a scientific question that also has relevance to policy matters. So in the last several years, there's been a lot of effort looking at wetlands as blue carbon sinks, so places where we can store carbon and have minimal methane emissions to the atmosphere, therefore providing a way for for wetlands to have a good effect on global climate. And because there are carbon markets and you can have carbon offsets, there's money involved, and that money that people can buy carbon offsets can be used to restore wetlands. So not only do you get carbon benefits, but you also get all of the other benefits that come from having healthy wetlands on the landscape. But the question becomes, where is a good place to have a blue carbon project? You want to have a site that's going to store carbon, but you want to make sure you're minimizing methane emissions to maximize the chances that your site, restoration project, will have a good effect on the climate. So there's a paper that came out several years ago in Wetlands by Poffenbarger et al., and my co-author on this webinar, Pat McGonigal, was also one of the authors on that paper. And they compiled a data set of wetland methane flux data. And those are the black symbols on this graph here. And what you can see is that as you go from tidal freshwater wetlands with a salinity of 0 down to salt marshes that have a salinity similar to that of the ocean, the rate of methane emissions from these marshes to the atmosphere goes down. In order to apply this to blue carbon issues, they then compared those methane fluxes with carbon sequestration rates. So the gray shading here shows various percentiles of the salt marsh carbon sequestration data set that Gail Chimura compiled over a decade ago. And by comparing the lower 5th percentile of that carbon sequestration data set, so you can be pretty confident that if you build a wetland, it's going to have carbon sequestration higher than this 5th percentile, with the 95th percentile of this methane versus salinity curve, so you can be pretty sure that your wetland is going to have a lower methane emissions than this 95th confidence interval here, they were able to figure out the salinity at which you could confidently say that, okay, if we do a wetland restoration project here, carbon sequestration is going to, the cooling due to carbon sequestration is going to exceed the warming due to methane emissions. And they found that that value was around a salinity of 18, excuse me, leading them to suggest that creating or restoring tidal marshes at a salinity of greater than 18 should reliably decrease radiative forcing. How would that conclusion change if we used, instead of the pulse global warming potential, we used the sustained flux global warming potential? So I've reanalyzed their data set using the sustained flux global warming potential that I presented earlier. And effectively what happens is this gray box that outlines the carbon sequestration data set, it shifts downward, which means that the same amount of carbon sequestration can offset a smaller amount of methane emissions. And when you look at where the lower bounds of the carbon sequestration data set intersects the upper bounds of that salinity versus methane flux relationship, you find that that intersection has shifted from a salinity of 18 to a salinity of about 23. So if we were to rewrite this statement from their paper, we would say that you should restore or create tidal marshes at a salinity of greater than 23 in order to reliably be confident that you're going to decrease radiative forcing of climate. So you can see that the choice of a metric here has not only scientific relevance in terms of determining whether a site has a positive or negative radiative balance or radiative forcing, but it also is applicable to policy questions in terms of where you can create or restore wetlands if carbon mitigation is one of the goals of that restoration project. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is extending the model in order to address some limitations of metrics like the pulse and sustained flux global warming potentials. Now, I haven't really focused on the limitations of these metrics except for the big one, that the global warming potential deals with a pulse emission of a greenhouse gas. But one of the limitations of these metrics is that there really is no correct answer when you're talking about the time frame. I mean, in both policy and scientific contexts, we typically use the 100-year global warming potential, but you could make an argument that using a shorter time frame, a 20-year metric, would be more applicable for some issues. But you could also make an argument that for other issues, a longer time frame, a 500-year time frame, for example, might be the right time frame for that question. So the issue of time frame is something that is built into the metrics, the global warming potential and the sustained flux metrics, but it's really a matter of personal preference and argument as to what the correct time frame is. Another issue is that these metrics implicitly ignore any gas that's remaining in the atmosphere after the time period of interest. So if you were looking at the global warming potential of methane over 20 years, after 20 years, there's still about half of the methane left in the atmosphere, but using a global warming potential ignores the methane and its warming effect after that 20-year time period. So that's a limitation of these metrics. And another thing that's built into the calculation of these metrics that's a limitation is the assumption that the flux rate doesn't change over time. So the methane flux rate or the carbon storage rate are constant for the entirety of the period you're interested in. So we can use this model to address some of those issues and see what happens in terms of addressing those limitations. So what we did is plugged real fluxes, not just assuming a flux of 1 kilogram per year, but we plugged real fluxes into this model. And again, for consistency, I'm going to use Sweethall Marsh. And if we look at the cumulative radiative forcing, we see that's the dashed blue line, which is the balance between the warming due to methane emissions and the cooling due to carbon sequestration. We see after 100 years, the cumulative radiative forcing is positive, which would lead us to the same conclusion we got with the global warming potential and the sustained flux global warming potential, namely that this site over a 100-year period has a positive radiative balance. But a really interesting thing happens if we run this model out farther. We find that that balance between warming due to methane and cooling due to CO2 switches. It stops rising, it plateaus, and eventually, after about 900 years for this particular site, it crosses the zero line. So after 900 years, the lifetime role of this wetland is not that it has a warming effect, but that it has a lifetime net cooling effect. So by looking at a different time frame, not limiting ourselves to a 100-year time period, we can learn some interesting things about the role of this wetland in influencing global climate. And for Sweethall, we've done some carbon-14 dating of the wetland deposits at the bottom of the soil profile, down about 7 meters, and we found that that wetland is roughly 3,500 years old. So for the first 900 years of its lifetime, assuming the fluxes were constant over time, this wetland had a net lifetime warming effect on the climate, but since then, it's had a net lifetime cooling effect on the climate, which is a really interesting insight. So that time that a system switches from having a net warming effect to a net cooling effect is called the radiative forcing switchover time. And we can calculate that for a variety of wetlands, as shown in the figure here, that differ in their amount of carbon sequestered and methane emitted. So if we look at these are all freshwater wetlands, we can see that the switchover time varies from about 60 years up to over 10,000 years. So this really suggests that if we're creating or restoring wetlands, especially freshwater wetlands, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that a wetland we create may have a net warming effect on the climate for a potentially long period of time, hundreds of thousands to years, unless we do something in the restoration or the creation guidelines that maximize carbon sequestration and or minimize methane emissions. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that we should not restore wetlands, because as I mentioned earlier, and I'll say it again, there are innumerable benefits to having healthy wetlands on the landscape. We just have to be careful if we're using carbon mitigation and climate mitigation as a rationale for those wetlands, because some wetlands may not have a cooling effect for a long period of time once they've been created. Now, if we were to look at salt marshes, because they have low methane emissions, they will have radiative forcing switchover times that are down here on the order of years, or some salt marshes and mangroves and other saline wetlands may have a net cooling effect on the climate immediately after their creation. Another thing that we could do with this model is we could incorporate fluxes that vary over time. And we can have emissions and exchanges of greenhouse gases between our wetlands and the atmosphere that vary over a time for a variety of reasons. We see, as shown in these two figures here, that methane emissions vary over time following wetland restoration. So on the top we have some freshwater wetlands, and it's been hypothesized that methane emissions will rise from the time of the wetlands creation and eventually reach a plateau that's similar to the rate of methane emissions from reference wetlands in the area. On the bottom figure we have methane production in salt marshes that shows the same general trend. Methane fluxes start out low, but as the plant community develops, the microbial community develops, and organic matter accumulates in the soil, rates of methane emissions increase. There's a similar hypothesis that rates of carbon sequestration could increase over time as the ecosystem develops. So I haven't done it yet, but it would be really interesting to incorporate these kind of relationships into the modeling I've been talking about to see how these changes early in the lifetime of a wetland project, how they affect the lifetime climatic role of that wetland. And we can also see fluxes varying for a variety of other reasons, including ecological succession, as herbaceous plants might become replaced by woody plants, or in response to environmental disturbances, whether they're changes in hydrology, changes in sea level, saltwater intrusion, nutrient enrichment. All these things have the potential to affect the storage of carbon in wetlands, but also the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide between the wetland and the atmosphere. So it'd be really interesting to incorporate those into this model to see how those disturbances and changes in fluxes affect our conclusions about the climatic role of specific wetlands. Okay, I now want to wrap up with a few concluding thoughts here. So the global warming potential was introduced 25 years ago, and it's been used primarily, or it was initially used primarily as a policy tool. And in those contexts, it can serve as a very effective way of comparing different greenhouse gases in terms of figuring out their effects on climate. As I've argued today, it is less useful as a science tool if we're interested in knowing how greenhouse gas emissions from ecosystems are affecting global climate. Now, as we move from the global warming potential to the right, we're increasing in complexity. So our sustained flux global warming potential is a little bit more complex than the global warming potential, and the models that I've been talking about are a little bit more complex still. That may limit their usefulness as a policy tool, but increase their usefulness as a science tool. Now, there are a lot of other metrics that I haven't talked about that have been used to ask questions about the effects of greenhouse gas emissions on a variety of systems. So there's the global temperature change potential, there's the climate change impact potential, there's the global cost potential, and there's the global damage potential. So they would be arrayed pretty much moving from left to right with increasing complexity. And as we increase in complexity, these metrics become more relevant to environmental systems or social or economic systems. But along with that increased complexity and increased relevance comes increasing uncertainty. So we as a wetland science community here, we as policymakers or managers or people interested in climate mitigation, we have to find the right balance between relevance to the issues we're interested in and the questions we want answers to, and the increasing uncertainty that comes as we get models that are more complex and more relevant to those issues. So that leads me to the first concluding point, and that there is no perfect metric. Every metric, whether it's the pulse or the sustained flux global warming potential or the global temperature change potential or the ones that I haven't talked about, they all have limitations, they have assumptions built into them, they're good for some questions, they're less good for other questions. So we need to decide what are the best ways of answering the questions we're interested in. Hopefully, though, I've been able to convince you that for the purposes of asking questions about the climatic role of wetlands, we should not be using the global warming potential. The global warming potential, in its definition and its formulation, considers a single pulse of greenhouse gas, whereas that is in no way realistic or relevant to what happens in wetlands and other ecosystems. Instead, we think that the sustained flux global warming and global cooling potentials are much more relevant because they do consider persistent emissions and exchanges of greenhouse gases between our wetlands and the atmosphere. They give us, these sustained flux metrics will often give us different answers than the global warming potentials, either in the magnitude of the warming or cooling caused by greenhouse gas fluxes, or potentially in whether the site has a positive or negative radiative balance. So there are, as I talked about, there are limitations to these metrics. Some of those can be addressed by doing more dynamic modeling that consider not just how greenhouse gas fluxes affect climate over a defined time period, but how they affect climate over the lifetime of a wetland project. And one of the interesting things we can do with these models is incorporate fluxes that vary over time as natural ecosystems develop or they respond to disturbance. So I think this can provide some interesting and powerful insights into how wetlands are affecting climate as we start to apply this to real systems and real sets of data. And I'm going to conclude with my first concluding point that there is no perfect metric. We think that the sustained flux global warming potential does a better job than the global warming potential, but it's likely that there are other and better ways out there that can address questions about how wetlands influence climate. So with our ecosystems paper that we published last month and with this webinar, both Pat and I are hoping that this will stimulate discussion among the ecosystem scientists, among the wetland scientists, about what we should be doing moving forward to most accurately and fully capture the way that wetlands are influencing climate. So with that, I just want to put up the header for our ecosystems paper in case you didn't catch the citation information for that and are interested in reading it, since a lot of what I talked about today is in that paper. And then at the bottom of the header here, we have my email address and that of Pat in case you have questions that aren't addressed during the question and answer session today. So I thank you for listening today, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Scott, for that engaging and thought-provoking presentation. If you're ready, let's open the question and answer period of our session. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in via the questions box, and I'll read the questions to Scott in the order in which they were submitted. To start things off, one person is asking, what were the units of salinity that you used in your salinity number?
Okay, I come from a marine science background, and in the marine science community, salinity is reported as a unitless ratio. So it's the ratio of conductivity of a sample to the ratio of a standard. So the units basically drop out, but those units are equivalent to practical salinity units or parts per thousand.
Great. How does using the SGCP affect Poffenbarger's model? Cooling potential.
Yes, it would. Actually, it would not affect that model. As I mentioned earlier, the behavior of carbon dioxide is symmetrical, whether the carbon dioxide is being emitted or removed from the atmosphere. So all that changes there with carbon dioxide is the sign of the effect on radiative forcing. And because they were dealing only with sites, well, their data set indicated that all their sites were emitting methane, so the global cooling potential would not be applicable in that context.
Next question is, so from a policy standpoint, it would seem that preserving existing wetlands is better than creating new ones.
I could give you a one-word answer or two-word answer of I agree. I mean, yes, if you have a wetland that's been around long enough that its lifetime effect on the climate is net cooling, it doesn't make sense to fill that wetland and create another wetland which may be very similar in terms of its methane fluxes, its carbon fluxes, but it doesn't have the entire history that would lead it to have a net cooling effect.
Next question is, are raised bogs with an age of 10,000 years definitely cooling in their lifetime?
I think that would depend on the ratio, well, it would depend on the ratio of carbon sequestration to methane emissions. There was a paper that was published by Steve Frolking and Nigel Roulet, I think it was back in 2007, where they looked at the lifetime climatic effect of northern peatlands, and I don't remember the exact time at which they switched from having a net warming to a net cooling effect, but it was, I think it was somewhere on the order of several thousand years. So I can't say for sure if the raised bog that the questioner is asking about would have a lifetime cooling effect, but I would say it would probably be getting close. And if that questioner has actual numbers, we could figure that out fairly simply.
Next question. So to do the sustained flux global warming potentials, can those who are not wetland biogeochemists fairly easily apply these models, or do policymakers, et cetera, need help applying this model, given this may be an improved model to use?
I think that using the sustained flux global warming potential is exactly as easy as using the global warming potential. Instead of multiplying your methane flux in units of grams of methane by the global warming potential, you simply multiply it by the sustained flux global warming potential. So yes, it's very easy. So that table that I had with the global warming potential and the sustained flux global warming and cooling potentials, all you would need to do is go into our ecosystems paper, pull that number out, and multiply your flux by the sustained potentials instead of the pulse global warming potential.
Okay. The next one, the questioner agrees with the general irrelevance of the GWP, but disagrees that we can just ignore it for ecosystems. The IPCC community of scientists would not concur, and your calculations in the end will have a chilling effect on wetland conservation, restoration, and creation. Having said that, this person still does not see how the calculations that you showed with your marsh budgets account for the decay of methane in the atmosphere, or are you suggesting that is built into GWP changes?
Yes, so I'm actually very interested in seeing how this new metric, these new metrics are received by the ecosystem community, but also the IPCC community. And I don't know if I agree with the questioner that they're going to be rejected or looked on skeptically. I think we've made a good argument that they are better than the GWP for the context in which we are applying them. And I'll also, in terms of this having a chilling effect on wetland conservation, I mean, that is certainly not our goal. We're just trying to get, I mean, I'm approaching this from the scientific question of what is the effect of these wetlands on climate, and if the metric that we've been using is not giving us a good estimation of that climatic effect, I think it's better to use a metric that is more relevant and more realistic, and then the consequences of that will follow once the science is good and established. So as I said, I think there's a lot of benefits to wetland creation and wetland restoration, and it just, these new metrics suggest that maybe the climatic benefits of restoring wetlands is not as great as we once suspected. And there was also, so there was also a question about methane decay, and that is part of the model. So when we have methane emitted to the atmosphere, that methane then gets oxidized over time at a rate that's consistent with the lifetime of methane from the IPCC report. So that methane is being oxidized within our model, and then that decay is implicitly part of both the global warming potential and also the sustained flux global warming potential.
How does using the SGCP affect Poffenbarger's model? How does using the SGCP affect Poffenbarger's model in terms of wetland creation salinity?
Okay, I think we had a similar question to that earlier, and the SGCP isn't relevant to the Poffenbarger data set because in their data set, all the wetlands that they found were emitting methane to the atmosphere. The SGCP would be relevant if you had wetlands that were taking up methane from the atmosphere.
Okay, next question. Any general thoughts about how this work applies to other wetland types, e.g. floodplains, bogs, etc.?
I would say just in a general context, I would say that, I was using a tidal marsh as an example because that's where I've worked and I had a lot of data, but you could just as easily apply these new metrics to any other wetland type and figure out their role in climate. And I see here Pat McGonigal is saying he can answer that floodplain question. So maybe, Pat, you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to say it's an interesting question because floodplain systems, for example, will go through periods where they emit methane and periods where they consume it. And because the global warming potential, or the sustained global warming potential and the sustained global cooling potential are quite different, I think the implications for a system like a floodplain forest are really interesting to explore.
Okay, thanks, Pat.
Okay, and this person asks, so conservation of raised bogs and mangroves becomes really a high priority, and mitigating these will not work in terms of cooling, correct? Question mark.
Yes, I think the conclusion there is similar to the answer I gave to an earlier question, that if you have a wetland that's been around long enough, like a raised bog that's been around for thousands of years and has already gone from having a lifetime warming effect to a lifetime cooling effect, it seems that it would be really important to conserve those kinds of wetlands.
Given that many wetlands are thousands of years old and assuming that there is a switchover point in most hydrogeomorphic types, isn't it likely that we're undervaluing the global warming potential based on these findings?
That we're undervaluing the role of these wetlands in climate? Is that?
The person wrote down undervaluing the global warming potential based on these findings.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly what the questioner is getting at there, so I'm not sure how to address that.
Okay, maybe we'll move on to the next one. Let's see. Will saltwater intrusion as sea level rises push wetlands towards a negative balance, or will increased decomposition of both fresh and brackish emit more greenhouse gases?
That is a very interesting question and something that I've been doing a lot of work on. And there's pretty much the jury is still out on whether saltwater intrusion will increase carbon sequestration or decrease it. There's been a fair amount of work that has shown that saltwater moving into freshwater wetlands decreases methane emissions. But at the same time, some studies have shown that saltwater intrusion moving into tidal freshwater wetlands increases rates of methane emissions. So there's a lot of interesting research going on in that area, but I think it is still too soon to say what the net balance, what the net effect is going to be.
On an order of magnitude, how does the typical methane emissions from a freshwater wetland compare to other land use land types?
Well, if you, I had a slide that I took out because I didn't have time to go over it, but if you look on a global basis, the wetlands are emitting methane. A lot of upland soils are actually sinks for methane. So I'm not sure about the numbers, but the direction of the methane flux is totally different between wetlands and a lot of upland systems. which then, in that case, applying the global cooling potential would be really important, because those systems, by taking up methane, those upland systems, by taking up methane, are not only sequestering carbon, but they're removing another powerful gas from the atmosphere. And we may have been underestimating that cooling effect in the past.
Thank you very much, Scott. We've answered a lot of questions, and we're just about out of time. Please mark your calendars for the next 2 webinars in the SWS webinar series. Both the November and December webinars will be presented at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're interested in presenting an SWS webinar or have a topic of interest you'd like to see us cover, please indicate this in the evaluation survey you'll receive after the conclusion of the webinar, or contact SWS headquarters. Thanks, Scott, for taking time out of your busy schedule and to make such an interesting and thought-provoking contribution to the SWS webinar series. And thanks to our audience for attending today's SWS webinar. We look forward to your participation in the upcoming webinar on November 11th with Beth Middleton.